What you see is summary of Chapter 4 College Preparation in the Public Policy and Higher Education book by St. John, Don Burnett, and Moronsky Chapman. I'm Crystal Hollenbaugh, and I've prepared this summary and questions for you. What I would like to start with first is a timeline of events that took place following World War II in order for us to understand sort of the upswing in discussions about education and higher education. In 1870, the University of Michigan is focusing on accrediting high schools that have curriculum that is, quote, consistent with the admissions expectations of the institution, end quote. At this point, the North Central Association of Colleges and Secondary Schools are recommending standards for high school certification and college admission. And this focuses on the beginning of accreditation boards and sort of the reinforcement of regional accrediting boards for higher education. So the University of Michigan begins this step in 1870. In 1892, the National Education Administration creates a committee that is led by Harvard College President Charles Eliot, and he investigates in order to investigate articulation between high school curriculum and college. This was a big step for the NEA in starting to connect institutions of higher education with high school curriculum. Instead, this accrediting body, the Association of College and Secondary Schools in the Mid-Atlantic States, suggested the inception of the College Entrance Examination Board, or the CEEB. And so essentially what happened is that there was this discussion among the New England states about the state of the high school curriculum. And the reality is none of these schools wanted to abandon the status quo of college admissions testing. And so therefore there was no focus or findings put on the high school curriculum and collaborating with higher education institutions, and instead focused on the admissions testing process. In 1899, John Dewey argued that aligning high school curriculum with college admissions standards would not solve the problem. He argued and supposed an educational structure which involved pathways, elementary education, elementary schools, grammar schools, high schools, academies, and vocational and normal schools. This was never fully realized. I think the example that Dewey was looking at is Finland, where there's a planned education process regionally that is connected to a larger overarching umbrella of standardized education in a K through 14, K through 16 format. In 1952, James Conant, he focused on requesting the comprehensive high school. During this time, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton met with preparatory schools, Phillips Exeter, Phillips Andover, and Lawrenceville, to discuss transitions between high school and college. At this time, a 7-year plan was created so that the AP curriculum was born in the hopes that there would be no longer duplication between high school and the college curriculum. So post-World War II, what we're starting to see are the desegregation of the armed forces and the GI Bill. And after World War II, the U.S. focus was on education and manufacturing. The GI Bill was passed, putting soldiers into education programs and skills programs. With the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces, African American soldiers were returning from war expecting the opportunity to attend college and racial equity. And the 1954 and 1955 landmark judicial decisions, which legislated desegregation in the U.S., and also U.S. schools and educational equality at the higher education level. And so these decisions would impact the coming movement for standards. In 1958, the National Defense Education Act was passed as an initiative to improve the innovation in math at the elementary and high school levels. And this is something that was never truly realized and remains primarily a loan program. The Higher Education Act of 1965, or the HEA, focused on Title IV becoming the umbrella for existing financial aid and equal opportunity grants. I I think that the larger focus for higher education is the 1972 reauthorization, and this focused more on Title III and special federal funding for historically black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, liberal arts colleges, tribal colleges, and community colleges. So as we move on to the standards movement out of these sort of political policies, the reactionary piece of A Nation at Risk, which Todd had mentioned in one of his earlier pieces, required these things, or recommended these things that you're seeing here. And what the focus was on is, at the time of the report, the authors state, quote, "At the time of the report, the nation was highly ranked internationally and deeply engaged in making up for the early history of unequal education." And the authors continue to argue that the nation was currently at that time underway of resolving sort of this unequal piece in education among not as much among socioeconomic classes, but racially. At that time, there seemed to be a similar or closer to an equal amount of racial admissions into the college systems. The problems at this time, we're focusing on these five pieces and requiring sort of a major overhaul of higher education in relation to the K-12 system. And A Nation at Risk essentially put political pressure on legislators to create policies for education to really develop a closer tie between high schools and college. And the problems with these particular movements that you're going to see is that A Nation at Risk focus sort of shifted that focus from underrepresented groups and now focused on extending opportunity for all, at which point we see that shift backwards from more of equitability among race to, again, sort of a loss in underrepresented groups in colleges and universities. Secondly, ANAR is supporting an integrative college preparatory system of high schools without really focusing on the requirements and the effort that has to go into that. As a result, you're seeing high school graduations drop from 71 to 71.8% in 1979 and 1980, from a 1969-1970 graduation rate of 78.7%. So we're seeing a 7% drop in graduation rates over a 10-year period. And the authors argue this could be due to the emphasis on innovation in education and leaving, essentially 7% of students out in the cold. Secondly, we're taking our eyes off the ball, and that's really where we're talking about that loss in graduation rates and not focusing on inclusive higher education and inclusive K through 12 education. Raising the requirements without essential funding resources to realize those goals. The authors state, quote, "Recalibrating schools in this way requires new personnel, extensive training, and a support mechanism that assists students and parents through the transition from high school to college." And so all of these things are necessary in order to meet this realization for ANAR. And then subsequently, the next president is not supporting that. And so any additional education legislation or programs was not going to be supported by that president. And so you have this giant report with all these requirements and suggestions and recommendations and little to no support. The underlying assumption that is discussed is that students need to be more prepared. And so new accountability methods of increasing graduation requirements and requiring content testing in order to receive federal funding, quote, stymied innovation. And this restricted teachers from being innovative and forward thinking in the classrooms. And so this is still an ongoing debate in education. It's still affecting the way that teachers are doing their jobs. And further, when we discussed prior, the other problem with ANAR here is that we were raising requirements without essential funding, and this included no additional funding for faculty for teaching in order to adapt to these new systems. So the other economic rationale for college for all is no longer economically sound. National and political support is not as popular as it was in better economic times. And lastly, that job placement as a result of the economic recession of 2008 no longer links college degree to a guarantee of jobs. And this is particularly startling in this case. New research and recent studies related to high school graduation success are a manipulation of variables attempting to explain the impact of policy decisions over decades of changed administrations. The data shows that students can be successful if the appropriate courses are taught at all schools and all students have access to them, and this is still not happening. With states in charge of public education, legislators further their own agendas by getting involved when it suits them. Today, for instance, the North Carolinian Board of Governors has chosen to get involved in health education at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, a state research university. They have banned student health educators from providing or making condoms available to students. And this is just one example. They've required a review of all health education programming to determine the appropriateness. How 1950s. So, in focusing on this chapter, in public policy, I've proposed these questions. What can be done to resolve reports from policy analysts receiving political pressure, specifically related to studies that are conducted and the different variables they're looking at? Secondly, what would an effective policy look like that reflects a genuine commitment to achieving social and racial equality? And finally, should families have a choice where to send their K through 12 students? And would this make a difference given private school choices that are available to families that have money? This is the review of the chapter. I look forward to seeing what you come up with, and I appreciate your time.